Hello, everyone, and welcome to another virtual meeting for the Central Ohio .NET Developers Group. We have a great presentation here tonight, but before we get started, we always have our usual slides to go through. Let's see, how many people we got in chat going on right now? Looks like we've got about 12 viewers, so hello, everyone. Can I get a quick audio check before I get too far down the line here, folks? Anybody? All right, I got it. Sounds good. There we go. All right. So we have the usual reminders. Our meetup group, that is where we need you to go and give us your signups so that we can notify you of every upcoming event that's coming on. We do have Twitter we post. Occasionally we'll post on Facebook. We do have the website, but that just redirects you over to the meetup group. So if you haven't joined our meetup group, please do it. Hold on here, my slide deck's not changing for me. There we go. YouTube, as always, we'd also like to invite you to sign up for YouTube. It looks like we're maybe about 10 more subscribers to go to hit that magic 100, which I believe is that special number that lets us get access to do some more cool things on YouTube. So if you haven't hit that like and subscribe and all that fun stuff that all the YouTubers normally tell you to do, please do that right now. We could really appreciate that. We got some raffles as well. Actually, I believe we might not have any Couchbase items tonight, but we always do have JetBrains things to give away, and actually we'll probably give away 2 JetBrains licenses tonight. I believe we've got a few backed up, so let's see if we can burn through a couple of those. We also have some other user groups in town, you know, speaking virtual, of course, but we like to make people well aware of. So there is a dedicated Central Ohio Azure user group. They meet the second Monday of every month. I believe they are back in person at the Microsoft office, at least the last I had checked. So if you want to get things that are more focused on the Azure side of things, check them out. There is a Clubus App Dev user group. They meet the third Monday of every month. I think they might still be online, or they've just recently switched to meeting in person. Again, check them out, see what's going on. And that's all kinds of, you know, modern app development activities. We have CBus Data. It's the Central Ohio Microsoft Data Platform user group. That's a wordful. They meet the second Thursday of every month, usually at the IGS Energy office that's in Dublin. So all your SQL Server, BI, all that kind of fun stuff, they're the folks to take a look at. Upcoming meetings, of course. Next month, we have Chris Woodruff will be doing a talk on Entity Framework. Assuming those COVID numbers look good, we're hoping that in November, usually beginning of December, we'll have a actual in-person holiday party, which will be the first time in like 2 years. So stay tuned for information on that. We'll probably start planning that sometime in October and see what we can get put together for that. And then it starts the brand new year, and we're planning and hoping that they will be in person. So the expectation is January 27th. Check out Aaron Petrie. He'll be talking about clean code and code refactoring. And then after that, we are open. So we are looking for your suggestions and help to fill those open TBDs. Speaking of, we had some meeting topics and suggestions that have been kind of passed along over time that we're kind of tracking through. So we still have a few things on Selenium, Kubernetes, Docker, Azure Functions. I know some, maybe you can help us find someone that might want to do some presentations on. And of course, any other topic is always welcome. So like I said, we've got an entire year to fill out and get back to meeting in person. So let's help us help you. You provide us with the speakers, and maybe you can be a speaker yourself and you have a great topic you want to share. Let us know and we can get you on the books. as well. We always like to try to help out. So, if you're looking for work or you're hiring, feel free to post it in the chat right now. If you're shy, don't want to, Matt Groves has graciously offered in the past, and well, he hasn't told me not to yet. Take it off that you feel free to send him an email and let him know that you're hiring or looking for work, and he can help make some connections for you. So there's always that's available. As Matt Ellen pointed out, we need to get a better list of presentation topics. So we'd sure appreciate your help in getting that list put together of topics that you would like to see. Speaking of things that you can help out with, we're looking for people to help join the team. Right now, it's just 3 of us, Matthew Groves, myself, and Matt Ellen. We're the ones that run this. We put it together. We get the speakers set up. We would love to get a few more people involved in helping us to organize and plan things. So if you have any, thoughts about maybe trying to get more involved in the local community, come talk with us. We'll be glad to help you out. And, don't worry if you don't really have connections yet. We'll help make connections. We can do things like that. It's all about just trying to make sure that we have plenty of people to help us operate and run these things. So, with that said, that ends up our slide. So, again, we have a great presentation tonight. So, let me make sure my screens are set up properly, folks. All right. Robert, can you hear me? Okay. Apparently my video is not going to play nice tonight, so I apologize for that. Let's get you full screened and you are good to go. Hold on a second. All right.
Good to go?
Okay, there we go. Your audio should be good now. Sorry about that, folks.
All right, so we're going to talk about Make the Web Faster this evening. A little bit about myself there. I've got my Twitter, my email, and my blog information. I do have the slides, and I've got 2 versions of the code for this. The idea for the talk is I have a before, so kind of just a straight up naive, here's a website. I'm not a designer, so I use Bootstrap, throw a fictional travel page together, and then the after is using the performance techniques, not all of them, but a lot of them from this talk, and show you the difference between before and after. So I'll have the link to the slides and the code at the very end. Some performance rules. So I'd worked on compilers for a while. I'm an ASP.NET C# developer. So years ago when I started looking at web performance, I came at it from the perspective of optimizing my server-side code. And at the time, Steve Soder's had a good book on, I think it was 14 tips for web performance and research. And it turns out that most websites, about 80 or 90% of the time that people are waiting is for page resources. So JavaScript, CSS, images, fonts, all of those kinds of things, typically not backend code. So I'll show you with some of the measurement tools that we're going to see where you can pin down if it does happen to be that you're in the 20%, where it's really server-side code you need to focus on, but we're going to focus on the front end and those resources in this talk. So the rules you want to follow, you want to make fewer HTTP requests. So obviously you don't want to request things you don't need. I put it in italics because I'll talk about it throughout the talk, but years ago I was using HTTP 1.1. And I had a lot of techniques I had to do because HTTP 1.1 only lets you have 6 connections per host. So for instance, if you came to my site and I had 50 images, you could only download 6 at a time. So the idea, there were techniques, and I'll go through them, about combining files to try to reduce the number of requests by bundling things together. HTTP 2 world, that's not a big concern. So I left it here because don't make requests you don't need, but you don't need to focus so much on the bundling and things. We want to send as little as possible, and we want to send it as infrequently as possible. So once we get into the techniques, we'll kind of come back to these rules that those things are important for one of these reasons. I want to talk about Fiddler. It's one of the tools I'm going to use for doing performance. So when people, I do a talk, people come up and say, will you look at my website and tell me what I should focus on? This is typically the first tool I'm going to open. It's a tracing tool built specifically for HTTP and HTTPS. It was written by Eric Lawrence, acquired by Telerik, and now Progress. And there's two versions of it. There's Fiddler Classic. I'm going to use that mostly this evening because some of the features I need are in that. The newer version, Fiddler Everywhere, is cool because it's cross-platform. The user interface has been simplified. And so they're adding more and more features into that. There's a few features that I need yet in Classic, and I want to flip back and forth during this. But Fiddler Everywhere is cool because of the cross-platform. So Fiddler Classic has always been a Windows tool. Fiddler Everywhere will run on Mac or Linux as well. So I want to show you using that. So let me I'll open up a browser here. And I'm going to open up Fiddler Classic. So what Fiddler is doing is it's sitting between my web browser and my server, so I can see all the traffic that goes back and forth. So I'm going to first pull up the before version of the site. So like I said, it's Bootstrap. It's pretty typical, not a designer, but a couple images. It's got some JavaScript functionality here. If I were to go look in Fiddler, I'm going to actually hit Control F5 to force it to refresh. There's a lot of things I'm going to look for in here to see if someone's using techniques properly. So I've done performance for a long time, so I know what I want to look for in here. As we get through the talk, we'll see some of these things that we should be searching for. In the meantime, I'm just going to call out a few of them, but I like to come in first and select all of those and look at the statistics. So this gives me an idea. There were 12 requests. So the typical web page today is about 100 requests. So you're not just asking for the HTML file, you're asking for lots of images, JavaScript, CSS, and it's a pretty typical size, about 3 meg. And so if I look here, I can also look at the chart, and I can get a quick breakdown of a lot of the page weight is actually the JPEGs, and I can see that based on the body size. So like I said, I'll come in here and I'll start looking for other things. Once I look at statistics, I'll also come through and I can sort by body size. So I can find big files. I can look to see if you're using caching, compression, minification, all the techniques we'll talk about. If I come back here and I run the after version, F5 on that as well to make sure the requests are made. And if I do the same thing and look at statistics, I'm still at 12 requests, but I'm at 128K. So if you think about that, we took the entire page from about 3 meg to about 128K. If you look, I had images that were 2 or 3 times that size before. So that's kind of the justification for the techniques we're going to talk about. And if you go back and look, visually it looks the same, but by being smarter about the techniques we're using, we can make those kinds of huge reductions in page weight, which we'll see will end up helping the user of the website get things faster. So again, that's Fiddler. I'm going to use it throughout, so I just wanted to talk about that briefly. When you think about performance, there are a lot of metrics that you can look at. So the first one I put in italics, the first byte, is more of an IT thing. That's how long did it take the browser to send to the server and get the first byte of the response. When we look at the tools, if that number is really high, you do have a backend problem, right? I mean, it's taking too long for your web server to give back that first byte. Typically, we'll see that that's not too bad for most websites. We're going to start looking, there's literally probably 50 different metrics people can look at. I've focused on speed index recently. So speed index was created by webpagetest.org, which we're going to talk about in a moment. But the idea is it gives you an indicator, and it's in milliseconds, of how much of the above the fold content on the page, how long it took for that to get displayed. So it's a good measure of a visual thing. So I'd use that for quite a while. Chrome now has come out with Core Web Vitals, so I'm shifting to use this. And the reason I'm doing that is because they're really focusing on 3 different things that are all important for a user's experience on your site. The first is largest contentful paint. So when you go to the site, there's typically a hero image or some big piece of content. That's going to measure how long it took before that was visible. So it's a good visibility sort, similar to speed index. First input delay will tell you if you have a lot of JavaScript blocking that's making it where even if they could see the page, they can't interact with it. And then lastly, I'm sure you've all experienced the cumulative layout shift. And what that means is you're on a page and you're about to click on a button and everything moves around, right? Now you've clicked on an ad or something you didn't intend to. So Google said we really want to focus on these three things, and they're under what they call core web vitals. They're going to use it for their page ranking, and it's being surfaced in a lot of tools. So I'm going to focus on that throughout the talk here, but those are kind of the three different components of that. So it's important for you to know when you're doing performance work, pick some metrics, because we're going to talk about measuring, because you want to be able to see that the things you're doing are making improvements in the areas that you feel are important. Talk about measurement then. I'll show you webpagetest.org. I just showed you Fiddler. Those are good ad hoc tools to get a gauge of how the page is from a performance standpoint. There's also two other types of measurement that I'll use that are more automated. The first is synthetic monitoring and what people would call lab data. So for our e-commerce site, we have a vendor that watches various pages on our site, homepage, category, products, things like that. And they call it lab data because it's the same set of computers every X number of minutes. And so the nice thing is week over week, I know that I've got consistent clients that are hitting my site at regular intervals. So if I make an improvement, I can kind of do an apples to apples comparison last week to this week. So that's where synthetic is useful. There's also real user monitoring. So this has come in the last few years where browsers, I put the specs here at the bottom if you're interested in them. Browsers have instrumented themselves to capture all the timings. So the resource timing is basically how long your HTML page took, the connection and everything. The navigation timing is I'm sorry, I've got to flip around. Navigation timing is stuff about the page. Resource timing is your JavaScript, CSS. So what it's doing is you find a vendor. Typically, you'll put a JavaScript snippet on your page, and it will measure everything, and it will show you timelines. So you get to see a real client's perspective of your particular website. And the nice thing is it's not like synthetic where I'm only watching 4 pages. This is watching every customer on every page on my site. So it gives me good insight into what's happening to real people. So let's pop over to web page test. So web page test, I can come out and put in my URL. They do have private instances if you have to do this on the intranet, but this is for internet. It's free. I can punch in a URL here and choose a location. They have various locations around the world that I could test from, and I can choose various browsers or device emulation. So I went and ran this for the before version and the after version. So I just want to show you what it would look like. First thing it does, it gives me some grades. So it does some basic looking for both performance and security and just gives me a feeling for where I'm at on various things. Then we get into the metrics section. So we talked about first byte. So you can see it took about 1/3 of a second before it got any response back. We talked about speed index. I'm going to focus on this core web vitals. It took about 2.7 seconds before the largest content was painted. You can see I've got some shift going on. So it not only shows me raw numbers, it gives me an indicator of how I fit with other companies, other sites, and from a user's perspective of what they want to see. So you can see my page is shifting around a lot, so they gave me that as a red. Blocking time really is not bad, and the largest contentful paint's kind of in the middle. And then there's other metrics we've got here on the side. So the cool thing is I can save off this URL and they will keep this test results for some period of time. So I like to do this. I'll run stuff before I make any changes. I can come out and capture this, keep this URL. Then I can make performance improvements, run this again, and then I can go back and compare them to show people things. First thing we'll jump into, it says run number 2 here was the median. So I'm going to come down and look at the waterfall diagram. So if you've seen waterfall diagrams before, I can see here's my HTML request. It took a little while for DNS, create a connection. It got my 2 JavaScript files. And then you can see these really long lines. These are images. So I can see just visually looking at this that I've got some JavaScript that held me up a bit. It's waited for some CSS. It started to get my images. Now again, because in this case I'm using HTTP 1.1, it's got to do some multiplexing and create multiple connections, excuse me. And I can see that those images must be somewhat large because they're taking a while to download. And then again, you can look in the connection view and see it didn't just do one connection, it created the 6 connections to go try to download those resources. So that's cool. I like to show when I talk to marketing teams and such, they don't always like to see the numbers, they like to see videos. So it's cool, you can also capture a video. So this is what somebody's experienced, and you could see some of that jump around, right? You saw some stuff, then it kind of shifted as stuff came in, and it took about 3.1 seconds before it was ready. It's interesting, I'd run this exact same site, I don't know, 9 months ago, and it was at 6 seconds. So just the browser agents themselves have seen some improvements to make that better. If I go run the same thing and look at the after report, you can see my grades are a lot better. I have a little work here to do on my security on the web server, but you can see my core web vitals are now all green. So I have no cumulative layout shift, I have no blocking time, and my largest contentful paint came down from 3-ish seconds or 2.7 to about 1. So again, I can look at the waterfall, and I can see, again, I had DNS and such, and then I can see all of the resources being requested. But you can see the width of the line is much smaller. It's fit the same width, but you can see that before it took seconds. I mean, this is all done by the time we're out here, which is about 1 second. And I'm using HTTP 2 here, so in this case, I only need to have 1 connection, which we'll talk about in a bit. And again, I like to show the video. So if I pop in here and show the video, this is the difference from a user experience perspective. At about 1 second, it just all paints and it's done. So again, some motivation for why we're going to use the techniques. And then again, I save these 2 so I can do comparisons as I make improvements to the site. Is it good enough? It's a good question to always ask. Does your website performance impact your goals? So it turns out Amazon and Walmart both intentionally slowed their websites by 100 milliseconds. So they did an A/B test. So we're going to leave these customers alone. These customers were going to slow down by 1/10 of a second. And they measured, and they actually lost 1% of their sales. It was interesting, they both lost the same amount. But by measuring like that, they know now exactly how important performance is to them. I would love to have my company let me do this, because every discussion for us, somebody comes and says, we want a new font. You know, this will look beautiful, the brand will be better, whatever. And I can tell them that'll cost you maybe another 100 milliseconds. I know from the industry, you're going to lose some sales off of that. Are you going to make enough? I would love to know what our number is, because every performance discussion from here on forward would be math, right? I could say, well, I know exactly how many sales you're going to lose by putting that font on. How much money are you getting just because you have a different font? And all the discussions would flip. So it's interesting to look at that if you can and understand quantitatively exactly how much performance matters for your site. How sensitive are your customers? They did more than just 100 milliseconds, but it was just interesting. How do you compare with competitors? So SpeedCurve is a good rum vendor. And if they have a page here where you can go look at other customers. And I like this because often somebody in your business might say, we seem slow, right? Why does it take our page so long to paint? You can come out and say, I'm in the US, I'm in retail, and if people were on a slow connection, what would their speed index look like? And you can show them that, you know, Amazon even is out here at 8 seconds. Most of the major players, right, are not painting in 1 second when you're on a slow connection. So it just gives you some ammo about how do we sit in comparison to major people in the industry. The other one that's useful, Google has what's called Crux. So if you go out to this site, I'm not actually going to run it here, but I'll show it to you. Everybody who uses Chrome that opts into telemetry are sending basically free RUM data back to Google. And you can come out here for your domain. If you punch in your domain, they will give you some stats about where you sit and what your score is, how long it takes for a mobile device to show your page, and if you're getting better or worse. So this gets put out every month. And like I said, if you can't afford to have a RUM vendor, this is basically free RUM with any of your clients that happen to use Chrome that opt into the telemetry. And there's some rules around when the telemetry goes, but it's a nice metric to show how you're doing improvement at a large scale. That I've got through kind of all the precursor, the measuring, how do you measure? Now I'm going to get into specific techniques. And I'll say I've tried to rank them kind of from a priority, right? So the top ones are typically really simple to do and have some really big benefits. I won't say that, I guess I'll put it this way. Take this advice, run a test, do this, run the test again to prove that it works in your site. But most of these are everybody will want to do, but again, test it for yourself and see. So the first one is HTTP compression. So the idea with compression is all the modern browsers support the ability to compress content. So if you know how PKZip and such work, they're taking your content and making it smaller. So files that could be compressed, JavaScript, CSS, your HTML, typically those things could be like 80% smaller. And so we turned this on. We were actually running out of bandwidth in our data center. We just turned on compression many years ago. And the next day we were using 53% less bandwidth. So instantly we basically got half our bandwidth back. And the other benefit was the synthetic measurements I talked about were 25% faster. So basically clicking a checkbox, we use IIS, suddenly we're saving half the bandwidth we spent money on, and things were 25% faster. So in IIS, we enable it for dynamic files. So we're ASP.NET, and you should have it for static files. So I just want to show you what that will look like. Go back to Fiddler here and just clear this out. And I will go back to the after version. I'm going to hit Control F5. And we'll show the difference. So if you look at, I'll just take this bootstrap. If I look at the inspectors, there's a little gold bar here that says this is encoded. So if I look, it says it's using gzip compression, and it's about 29 or 24K. If I were to take off that compression, you can see it was 160K. So that's a huge win, right? From a less to download perspective, using less data plan for my customers and just making it faster. So again, compression's a pretty easy win. Content expirations are next. I want to leverage the browser's cache. So my goal is if you came to my website for the first time, you're going to get my ASP.NET page, get the HTML. You're going to have to download all my fonts, JavaScript, CSS, images. If you were to come back close your browser, come back the next day, you're going to hit my ASP.NET page. Possibly something's changed. So I'm going to run that, give you the HTML. If nothing else has changed, I would love to pull all of the other content out of your browser's cache. Well, it turns out by default, if you're not setting content expirations, you're leaving it up to the browser to decide. It may look and say, yeah, I have that image right here, but I'm not sure if it's fresh. I'm going to go back to the server and ask. So if you ever see traces where you see an if modified sense that comes back with a 304, you went to the server to ask if it was fresh, only to find out you had the freshest content. So the idea with expirations is I just folder by folder, I say, I want my images, for instance, to be 30 days. So by saying that, I'm saying if you had an image, it's in your browser cache, and it's been within the last 30 days, just use it, okay? It's easy to set up. I'm not going to go through, everybody on here might be using different web servers and such, so you have to look up how will you set content expirations. but I recommend that you do it. So I set it for all my images, my JavaScript, my CSS, my font files, because I don't want to leave it up to the browser whether they think they have to come back and check. I just want them to not come back and ask until that period is over. So when I say that, sometimes people get concerned because they say, well, maybe I have logo.svg, right? And tomorrow we suddenly have a new corporate logo and we must have everybody see it, right? It's rare that they really have to see the latest content, but if they did, I just need to change that URL. So I could name it logo1.svg or logo.svg v=2 or something. Anything that makes the URL different makes the browser look and say, I don't see that exact URL in my cache. I'm going to go back to the server. So that's kind of the best of both worlds. You'll use everything from their cache, but if you need to, you can force an override by changing the URL. If I go back here, you can see that I've got caching on when you look at this column. So this is actually in seconds. So I'm going to slide this over a little bit. This happens to be 30 days, and then this turns out to be a year. Okay, so that is content expirations. Next one is a content delivery network. So I love how things work, right? People were doing web development for a long time and two people at a bar got in an argument, right? What matters more, bandwidth or latency? So they decided to run a study. They didn't find anything, so they went out and they said, every ISP you ever talk to says we are, 10 megabits per second or 1 gig or whatever. All ISPs ever talk about is bandwidth. It turns out and you can go follow that study there, read the whole document, and bandwidth, it helps at first. So when you first have, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 megabits per second, but it eventually plateaus pretty quickly, that adding more bandwidth for the typical site. So I'm not talking about Netflix and streaming. I'm talking, normal sites you and I probably develop. Adding more bandwidth doesn't really help. What really does matter is latency. So latency is how long it takes for the browser to talk to the server and get a response, right? That's distant, dependent, depends on what your network is using as far as fiber or other things. So from a latency perspective, I really want to serve content that's closer to my customer than my data center. So my data center is in Minnesota, but I want for you in Ohio, I want you to be able to come, the first one of you that came to my website, you would go get my HTML from my data center. My page will reference content from the CDN, and I'll show you how to do that. And when it does that, when it goes to look up the DNS name for my CDN, the trick is the CDN will find the closest server it has to where you are located. So the CDN we use has hundreds of nodes around the United States. There's ones that have them all across the world. And so the idea is now, if you're the first person to come, you'll go to that CDN server and say, where are all these images? They won't be there. That CDN server will get it from my server in Minnesota, but it will cache it then. And it will use all the caching rules we just talked about. So now every other visitor that comes in near that CDN server will get it from there instead of having to travel to Minnesota, if that makes sense. So I use it for static files. So all of my images, my CSS, my JavaScript, web fonts, all those things I actually serve off of a CDN. And this was another huge win for us from a bandwidth and from a performance perspective when we started using this decade or more ago, before they were really popular. Again, we didn't have enough bandwidth here. And so this was a way to reduce our bandwidth load that also helped a lot with performance. And the good news is there's so many CDNs now, they're really very affordable for you to be able to use. Let's load. So typically I'm going to reference images just by doing this, right? I'm just referencing an image within. This would pull from my server, in my case in Minnesota. Instead, when I do a CDN, they will give me a DNS name. I will reference everything from using that, and then that will go to the closest server and pull. So it's a slight change I had to make to how I reference all of my images. But again, there's a lot of performance benefits for doing that. Talk about bundling and minifications. I put the bundling in italics again because I'm going to talk about that with HTTP 1.1. but you should use minification. So the idea with minification is you can minify your CSS, your JavaScript, possibly your HTML. I don't, because sometimes taking out the white space can affect layout. And I also haven't found a good tool to do it on the fly for me for ASP.NET. But for JavaScript and CSS, we've used it for a long time. It takes out white space, comments, etc. So most of you have probably seen the minified before, but I'll show you if you have not. It looks like this, right? All the white space is gone. So it makes the file smaller, which again makes it that much faster to download. So if we were to go compare, oops. I've got the after version. So let's take this bootstrapmin.js is about 60K. If I look at the performance before and look at the JavaScript, it's about 134K. So again, I've dropped that more than half just by taking out all the white space and stuff. So if you're doing development and you need to troubleshoot on the client, just be aware DevTools has a pretty print, so you can unminify. There's a way in Fiddler, if you get an extension, you can tell it every minified file that comes back from the server, please unminify it. What we use in production is actually source maps. So you can actually create a mapping file in our build process that says the mapping from the minified back to the original source. That's what that file does. So if you open up DevTools, it'll go pull the map file, and then it'll be your true JavaScript source in the client so you can troubleshoot. Again, none of my customers care, right? I want smaller files so it's faster for them, but if I do have to troubleshoot, I can do that. In the 1.1 days, we actually took every JavaScript file we have and bundled it into a single JavaScript file. Again, because I only had 6 connections per host with HTTP 1.1, that was a good decision. Now with HTTP 2, I'm going to not do that. But when I did the bundling and minification, it took me probably 6 hours using free build tools, and our homepage was 50% faster. It's not very often that some of the things we talked about, checkbox for compression, 50% 50% better bandwidth. Do a build process, minify your file. Suddenly my homepage is 46% faster. Those are some really great wins. Next, we'll talk about images. So for a long time, I've been doing web forever. Before there were web fonts, designers would say, I want this thing to be in a certain font. Because those fonts weren't supported, they weren't web-safe fonts supported by all the different browsers, designers often made an image that had whatever the text they wanted in the font they wanted, and we'd have to use an image instead of text. That hurt SEO, and also the images are just a lot bigger to download. Now that there's web fonts, use CSS3 features to avoid images if possible. A better example might be gradients. We would show a gradient using an image that's just built into CSS3 and it's very small. So if you don't need an image for something, try to avoid it and use CSS3. If you do need an image, make sure you pick the proper type. So if it's a logo, use an SVG. If it's a photo, today, JPEG, possibly if you want, AVIF or WebP, or in the future, JPEG XL, not PNGs, and I'll show you why. And again, I get in debates about these things with people. If you don't believe me, try it. So I did it myself. I said, somebody challenged me on the PNG, so I came out and did it. So I went to Australia. You can actually walk up Sydney Harbour Bridge, which is kind of cool. This is the picture, and this is a JPEG. If I pull up the corresponding optimized PNG version, looks about the same. The problem is the PNG is 516K and the JPEG is 58K. It's almost 10 times larger. Why is that? I'm going to talk about because I can compress JPEGs. That's why it matters. So again, JPEGs, WebP, AVIF, whichever makes sense for you. I am still using JPEGs. I'll show you why. If you've been to Can I Use before, AVIF is a cool feature coming out. So Can I Use just lets you put in HTML or CSS or in this case image formats, and it will show you how well supported it is across browsers. AVIF is not there yet for me. I would have to do polyfills and other tricks that I don't want to do. So I still use JPEGs in this case, but the important thing is I'm not using a PNG. The other thing to focus on is responsive images. And the idea with this is, so years ago, people started doing responsive design, and that just means you can do markup that will fit well on a phone, tablets, desktops, different breakpoints. The problem was when it first came out, all there was image source tag, right? Image source equals whatever. So you had to choose, well, what image I'm going to use? Well, somebody might want to see it on a desktop, so they would use their best, high quality, largest image, and that's what they would use for responsive. Well, the people on the phone back then with slow connections are pulling a super large image that's then going to get shrunk down to show on a mobile device. So a consortium came together and worked with the browser vendors to get responsive images to work. So if you're not using these now, that's something you should be using if you're doing responsive design. And what it looks like, instead of being image with a source, ignore this part for a moment, there's a thing called source set. So I can take the same image and shrink it to various widths. And so you can see I'm saying I have 128, 256. I also put my width right in the name of the file, so I can look at my log files and see what the most popular sizes are. But by using source set, I'm telling the browser, you know how big a space this is. You can look at the network connection speed, the pixel density of the device. You're going to make a better choice of the image to serve to this customer than I am. And I didn't like that at first because I kind of like to be in control. But I gave it up, and we've been doing this for years, and it works great. And again, why do I care? If I were to show you the bridge walk, 128 width is 2K. The one for a desktop high pixel density is 187K. That's almost, 100 times larger. That's huge difference. And when I'm only showing it, if we go back to performance, either one of these two, when I'm only showing it up here or in a small thing like this, I don't want to download a huge image. So it just is that much smaller by using that technique. It's a little more markup, but life is trade-offs, right? I'll mention client hints. It's another thing browsers are working on, where instead of you doing source set and stuff, the client can actually tell the server with headers, here's my pixel density, here's my size I'm going to want. All that information gets sent in headers, so the server can just choose the right image to send without some of the markup. So it's a little early for me, but I just wanted to mention that that's there. So again, why JPEG? Because I can trade off size versus quality. So whenever I tell a designer that, their turtlenecks start choking them or something, and they are not excited about that. So I explain I'm not trying to make it look horrible. I'm trying to get the balance between still looks good, but is a lot smaller. And I can often cut size by 50% or more. And we usually discuss it for a while, and I finally just say, look, I'm going to make a page with the image at various compressions. If you can tell me what you think is the original and it's yours, you can use it. And if you can't tell mine and it's a lot smaller, we're going to use mine. So I throw in a few freebies here, right? That sucks. That's kind of bad. But if you look at the rest of these, it's pretty hard to tell which one of those was the original and the ones that I tweaked with for size. Turns out this is the original. It's about 172K. The one right below it is 32K. So it went from 172 down to 32. And even stacked side by side, it's hard to tell the visual differences. So typical sites, typical customers, it's a really easy win. So when you saw the before and after, most of the before was too large of JPEGs. So they just weren't optimized. So again, I use PaintShop Pro. You can use Photoshop, but most of those tools will show you the original, and it has a little slider. So you can just slide the compression amount and see what it does to the image. So you just slide it to the point where you think it's visually close, but you're saving a lot on your data. The other thing with JPEG is there are image optimizers. So when you take a picture, it has metadata in it. So if I were to go back and look at one of these, I'll look at this flag with bridge. So I took this on a camera, and if you go into details, you can see I used a Canon PhotoShot G1. Here's my shutter speed. None of my customers care about that. right? They're never going to see this on the website, and yet this takes up space. I can use a tool. I happen to use JPEG Tran, and what it does is it will strip out that metadata. So if I go look, that metadata is gone. And Fiddler actually has a cool tool. This is one of those classic extension ones called Show Image Bloat. If I go back here, I'm going to pull up that. I've got a page with 2 images. If I hit Control F5, you'll see 15% was how much of that image was metadata, and it has no visual impact on quality. So just stripping that metadata out, that file is going to be 15% smaller. So I like to turn on that image bloat, hit my site, because we're supposed to be taking metadata out, and it's really obvious when you're not, because it'll show you which ones have metadata and how much space it uses. Turn that off. The other cool thing with JPEG, you can do what's called progressive JPEG. So again, I'm going to use Fiddler. I'm going to make it intentionally slow and act like a modem. And I'm going to show you the difference. So JPEG has 2 types. One's called progressive and one's a baseline. So the one on the left is progressive. So what it does is it shows the whole picture right away, slightly blurry, and then improves the quality. Most of the JPEGs on the internet, like 90+%, are the default, what's called baseline. So if you watch it paint again, from a performance perspective, the left one right there looks done. And yet the right one gives you the impression the site is super slow. So progressive was really hot back in the modem days. It's getting interesting again, just because there are people who have bad connections. You know, don't test like a developer where you're on 1 gigabit. People have bad connections. So you can actually switch your JPEGs to be progressive, and it gives the impression that your pages are painting faster. Generally, the size will be the same, so there's not an actual savings from a footprint, but perception is reality, right? It seems like the one on the left is done a lot faster. Now, some people don't like the blurry and get sharper, so again, try this out for yourself, but if people are on a slow connection, they're going to like that. And people on fast connections, it comes in clean right away, so you don't need to worry about the slight blurriness for a bit. The other thing with images is lazy loading. So we're a food site, and we used to use, like search engines would, we'd show 9 products, and then we'd have page numbers. So you'd hit next page, next page. Our designer came and said, it'd be great if we just showed all the images, just scroll down and see them all. And I said, well, that's cool, but as the performance person, that's going to suck, right? If I have 50 images on that page and you have to sit and wait for all of them just to get your page to paint, that's unfortunate. You might never scroll down. So we implemented lazy loading. So all this says is I identify images that are not quote unquote above the fold, meaning this area that is visible in the viewport for the customer. So if I go back to here, this is what they call the above the fold from a newspaper reference. These images that are down here, people may never scroll to. You know, the further down, the less likely they're scroll. So what this thing does is I happen to use a JavaScript lazy sizes. We've used this for many years. I just have to drop that into the page and augment the markup slightly. So I'll show you what you have to change. So this is what I alluded to before. If this were just image source set, it would have made the choice right away. When I put this data dash in front of it, data dash is telling it, the browser, ignore this attribute. Client-side JavaScript's going to use it, ignore it. So when the browser came, it said, I have an image, but I don't have a source or anything, so I have nothing to do. I also tack on this lazy load class. Then I include that JavaScript here. And what that JavaScript does is it watches the person using the site as they're scrolling and an image is about to come into view. It will change the data source set to source set, which forces the browser to do the download. So I'm not going to go through it here. If I turned on Fiddler and I marked how far we are, and then I scroll down, you'd see that these images don't get downloaded until someone actually scrolls. It's true on our site, if you scroll down super fast, you might see a spot for just an instant where the placeholder is for the image and then the image comes in. Again, right, life is trade-offs, try it for yourself. we save a lot of download, and the first paint really improves because rather than waiting for some of these images, this stuff gets painted a lot sooner. So it's a good technique. There is native support now, so there's actually a loading attribute. Again, if you go out to can I use, it's not, I think it's all the iOS, Safari types, Mac OS that don't support it. And so again, not terribly useful for me, so I'm still using this JavaScript. But again, it's a pretty good win. Now this, I'll warn you, is a custom code that I wrote myself, and I call it deferred loading. So the idea with this is I have third-party things I need to add into my website that are from vendors that I don't want them being slow to impact my paint. So for instance, virtually every third party I use on my site, I'm going to use this technique. It doesn't always work for various technical reasons, but the idea would be right here. I've got this JavaScript file down here at the bottom. And if this is not important to the page paint, instead of saying script source, I made up this data-deferred source. So when the browser sees this, it won't do anything with it. Then I hook into the onload event. So when the onload fires, which means that all the main resources on the page are there, and it's very likely the page is painted, this then fires. And then I wrote some JavaScript that just says take every data deferred source and change it to source, and data deferred source set to source set. Very similar to the concept of lazy sizes, but this lets me use it on elements, and it lets me push them not until the person scrolls down, but until major stuff on the page is already done. So that's very useful for us. I try to use it for every third party. If it doesn't impact or isn't required for my paint, I want to shove it later in the process so it doesn't hold other stuff up. It can't do that. JavaScript did add some features. So specifically JavaScript, the script tag does have ways to have load happen later. So I'm going to show you an example of this. So by default, I've got these 3 JavaScript files, and I'm going to go use another trick here in Fiddler. There's an autoresponder in everywhere it's called rules. I can set up a rule and say when you are trying to get alert 1, make it slower by 4 seconds. I'm intentionally making these JavaScript files be various slowed so I can see what kind of an impact that would have on people using my site. So if I were to go back here and go to that page, the important thing is it's sitting spinning and the customer sees nothing, right? They're looking at a blank page. Now my JavaScript runs, and then suddenly the content I want them to see shows up. If these JavaScript files are not required for the display, a few years ago they added this, it's called async. And what I'm doing by saying async is I'm saying I want you to not make the browser wait. Don't sit here. Allow the parsing and the painting and everything to continue. Get these files in the background. So now if I go back and run this, like Control F5, you can see I have the content right away, and then it's downloading. Now what you'll see here that's weird is the second file finished first, then the third, and then the first. So what async says is, I don't care about the order of these, I just want you to move them in the background. Every third-party vendor in the world I work with says, please put my JavaScript in the head at the very top above everybody else because my stuff's really important, and put async on it and you're fine. It won't impact you. Not really true. It's true that while it moved it to the background and I'm able to do my stuff, but as soon as this thing is done downloading, everything comes to a halt again while it executes that JavaScript. Then it goes on. So async is better than the default, but it's still not great. Another option I prefer better is defer. And what defer says is 2 things. I want these to run in the order I have them listed, because sometimes I have, maybe this is jQuery library and then some plugins that depend on jQuery. I may care what the order of these are. If I put defer, they'll get run in the order they are, but they get run later. So even though they're done downloading, they get held up later in the process. Not all the way to onload, which mine would do before that, but at least not as soon as it's done downloading. So that's another option if you want to. Browsers have actually added a lot of resource hints lately. So these are useful as well, and it's easier to show what they do. So here I've got a JavaScript. I've got to comment it out for now, but I know I need some JavaScript. I can give these hints up above to tell the browser, I know that you need to eventually connect to ajax.microsoft.com. Why don't you go out and pre-connect to that? So as soon as the browser sees that link, it's going to start do the DNS lookup, create the HTTPS connection. All that stuff takes time. And if it's a while before the browser parser would get down here, that's all a win because I'm just getting that ahead of time. I've seen people go nuts with that, so don't go nuts with that. There's some good studies that if you just try to pre-connect to everything, you can actually cause yourself some problems, so use it judiciously. But on your most important, like for me, I may want to pre-connect to my CDN right away. And I gave it to you as demo in a meta tag. You can actually give it as a server response header. So you can go into your server and say, send this as a response header. The browser will see that immediately when it sees the response before it even starts parsing. So I'd recommend do it in the server response header, but for giving it to you in a demo, I did it in a meta tag. So again, test this stuff, right? I've seen some sites and studies where it makes a huge difference and cuts off seconds for them. I've run it for my own and it wasn't that drastic, but test it out and see if that is an improvement for you because that's easy to add. That one just pre-connects. I can also preload files. So this one says, not only do I want you to pre-connect, but start getting the JavaScript file that I know I'm eventually going to need. So that'll actually get the whole file. Those are kind of cool. A couple miscellaneous things. Again, I really try to focus on getting the page rendering as quickly as possible. So I've looked at things like inlining CSS and other things just to make that first paint, largest contentful paint, as fast as possible, as opposed to things I used to do in the past. Another note, URLs are case sensitive. So I show you what this looks like. So I've got, it wouldn't be like this. I'll give you a better example, but I've got a page that references the same flag bridge JPEG, but it just uses different case. So you can see this is all lowercase. The top one has F and B capitalized, and the other one just has F capitalized. From a browser's perspective, those are three different URLs. And so if I go into any modern browser and I trace that, and I go back, look at Fiddler, it had to ask for the exact same image 3 times. I don't think someone's going to do this on a page, but what does happen is I happen to like this. I think it's called camel casing. The first ones are capitalized. I would just always do my stuff like that. Turns out the other developer likes all lowercase. So we're doing completely different pages, maybe logo, whatever, right? But we're referencing the same one. So they came to my page first. They went and got the stuff. We used expirations. We compressed the image, yay. So it's sitting in the browser cache waiting to be used. They go to the other page, and just because the developer referenced it using a different casing, they have to go re-download the thing all over again, and the browser cache has to store 2 of the same thing. So when we saw this, we just made the rule, everything is lowercase. It's just easier to know. That way we're consistent on how we reference things. Let's skip some of those for now. I'll just mention font subsetting. So it's possible sometimes you'll get a font. For instance, we had a font that had a lot of Asian characters in it. And so the font we were given to put on our website was 2 meg. And I took it out to, I think, Font Squirrel and said, I don't want any of the Asian languages because I just want the English. And it went from 2 meg down to 28K. So if you have fonts, make sure they're as small as possible by doing things like subsetting. Want to talk about HTTP2. So I mentioned this. This came out in 2015. I've got a whole talk on this. I'm not going to go into all the details. The main benefit is that instead of having the 6 connections per host and only downloading one thing on each connection, they use what's called multiplexing, which just means the browser will open up a single connection, do the whole handshake and everything, and then everything else they need from that host, they'll download it essentially in parallel. So I'm going to show you an example that I love and hate at the same time. So this is using HTTP. If I do the HTTPS version, look how much faster. That was 85% faster. And you think, wait a second. That same page using encryption is 85% faster than the other one? That's, there's no way. Well, it turns out the HTTP is using HTTP 1.1. The HTTPS, you need to use HTTPS in order to enable HTTP 2. And again, it was a lot faster using HTTP 2. So that's cool, and it's true. If you download a lot of resources from a single host, HTTP 2 can show some large improvements. The part of the demo I don't like, I don't have a page that has 360 unique little check marks, right? So it's a little unrealistic. Your mileage will vary a bit. Again, test it, but we just had to turn on HTTP 2, so it's just a server setting, and we saw a good improvement again, especially on high latency connections. Not having to open up all those connections is a big win. So that's something that I would recommend that you look at as well. I don't actually have it in the slides. The other one we've done recently is TLS 1.3. So TLS 1.3 is the most recent TLS that underpins HTTPS. It has changed how the handshake happens between a browser and a server, and it's cut it from 2 round trips down to 1, and for return visitors, possibly 0. So we went in again, we set a setting and said, hey, if the browser supports TLS 1.3, use it. It's a much better security, but we also got 20% faster just by flipping a checkbox. So look into that as well. Things that you probably don't want to do anymore if you use HTTP 2. These are just tricks that I had taught for years to try to reduce the number of requests you were making. I talked about bundling all my JavaScript together and all my CSS together. Domain sharding. If you had cdn.example.com, people would create CDN1 and CDN2 because each of those would get 6 connections. So you'd have a total of 18 connections. None of this helps you anymore in an HTTP 2 world. So if you were doing these things, reconsider those. Want to talk about some other tools quick. So I'll go actually to DevTools first. If you're not too familiar yet with performance techniques, if you go into DevTools, there's a Lighthouse tab. This is like AI audits you can run on your page. So I'm going to run a performance mobile against my before version of the site. What this is going to do, it's going to run some tests and score me and tell me, first of all, what's my score from 0 to 100. But it'll also, more importantly, tell me things I should fix. So actually, that's better than it has been. But it gives me all the metrics. It said I scored 58, but the important part is down here, right? I'm not using HTTP 2. I'm not sizing my images right. I shouldn't be using, old formats for images. I should do my JavaScript better. So text compression. I mean, everything we talked about, minification. So if you're not familiar with these things, this is really handy because you can come and run this and it'll just tell you these are things you should fix. I'm going to go see if I will look out here still. I'm going to run the same report for the after, and I just want to see how the score is. If the planets are aligned correctly here. They're not. I had 100 the other day. I'm sad. All right. So I'm at 98, but the point is it still has things I can work on. And the cool thing is if I don't understand what they're talking about, like I don't understand what you mean by reduce CSS, they typically have learn more links where I can go out and read because there are things in DevTools. They're basically telling me I happen to be using Bootstrap. There's a bunch of stuff in the Bootstrap CSS file that I don't use on this page. So I can go strip some of that out if I want to. But again, that's cool. It's cool also if you go out to page speed, it's really Lighthouse but also the RUM data we talked about from Chrome before. So not only do I get the same scores, but it will also overlay the real user data from Chrome visitors to my site if I'm a big enough site. So I get to have some free RUM mixed into the Lighthouse stuff, which is cool. And we talked about Fiddler before. I use Fiddler a lot to intentionally slow things. So I will, I have a new vendor that wants to put something on my page. I will make them slow or fail and then see what that does to my performance. So if they say, oh, you're fine if you do async, and I'll set it to run in 20 seconds and not so much, right? I mean, I can prove those things. It's hard to simulate specific pages being slow or failing, and that's where I like to use Fiddler for perf. Some quick resources. So I do have a Pluralsight course on web performance that goes into all the details about this and shows you how to do the JPEG compression and such. I have one on Web Developer's Guide to Images about why JPEG, not PNG, shows you how to do the compression. I also have two on Fiddler. First one being, if you have a problem with your website, should you use Fiddler or Chrome DevTools to solve it? And then I have one just on pure Fiddler. And that's Twitter, email, blog. That's the link to the slides and the code. And again, you'll have the before and after versions of the site. So I don't know if there's any questions in the Q&A. It's a lot of stuff to cover. I'm more interested that you caught what the techniques, why they're beneficial, and you can dig into how do you turn them on a given server than, I mean, we didn't have enough time to show every feature and how you light them up.
All right. Well, thank you very much. That was an amazingly detailed presentation.
You're welcome.
I can't speak for everyone else, but I just learned, like, I swear, 10 new things that I'm like, oh, I didn't know I could do that.
Awesome.
That's cool. All right. Any questions, folks? I haven't seen any show up yet. You're all being quiet.
So I will mention, I also, that.us, if you're familiar with that conference, they have a new online community where they do monthly events. I've been doing, I call it, I guess I name it different things, but basically my site has performance issues. If you bring me your URL, I will sit with you for an hour and basically troubleshoot your site, run these tools with you, and show you specific tips for you. So if you do this and you go and try some stuff and aren't getting anywhere, check that.us. It's every month. I've been trying to do every month where I have an hour or so that I'm open for. It's basically office hours for bring me your perf problem and I'll give you practical things you could fix. So if you're about to have an annual review and you want to make your site faster just before then, show up, bring your URL, and we'll see if we can make it faster for you.
Okay, everyone's being quiet today, apparently, so.
Okay.
I'm sure people will have questions later. And of course, feel free to bounce him a message on Twitter or email.
Yep.
So let's get to some prize drawing. Let's do a last call for signups. If you have not, I shared the link earlier in chat. Let me share it one more time. Hold on here. There we go. Give everyone another minute. I actually do have one question for you as I was thinking about
Sure.
it. You'd mentioned there were a couple of plugins for Fiddler. Could you point those out?
Yes, let me share again here quick if you want.
I know that'd be handy for.
So in Fiddler Classics, I'm hoping they're going to put this in everywhere, but I haven't seen it yet. I got to find where I have it's Fiddler add-ons. Let me go to one of my other demo things here. So it just has a list. So this was the image bloat one that I showed you where it shows you the metadata.
Okay.
So you just download that, it will install that extension, and then I just lit it up. once it's an extension, it adds to the menu system. So I just pick show image bloat. And then when I request the page, it will show me all the images. We talked about, there's a whole lot of cool ones out here, but this JavaScript formatter, this is the one that unminifies minified files. So if you're going to a server that doesn't have source maps and you don't want to hit pretty print and dev tools for every one of them, if you turn this thing on, it will unminify, because Fiddler's sitting between the browser and the server. As the minified files come into Fiddler, it unminifies them and sends them to the client so that you'll be able to step through them, if that makes sense. But yeah, if you just go to Fiddler/add-ons is where you can find those.
All right, I think the only question we have is, what's the story behind the Led Zeppelin?
Oh, so my daughter takes records and paints them. So our local music store, she did all of these records and has them hanging all over this music store with various artists, and Led Zeppelin's my favorite band. So that's the one that she made for me, which is cool.
All right, let's see here. We're going to call it, folks. If you haven't signed up for the prize drawing, well, you had your chance. So let me close out, get the results. All right, we had 13 people sign up. So we're going to give away 2 ReSharper licenses. So I tell you what, you pick a number between 1 and 13.
You want me to pick?
Yep.
About 7.
7. So that was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Pete Matthews, are you still here and in the chat? Let's see. Somehow I can see a list of people that are in this chat. Pete, are you there? This is the problem. We should just probably email it to him and make it life easier for all of us, since no one ever responds. All right, so we'll say Pete wins. Pick one more number between 1 and 13.
How about 2?
2. We have Gene Huh. Looks like you are our second winner. So congratulations to you too. I will email you the JetBrains codes. It's a coupon code, I guess, technically, for any of the JetBrains products. So you're free to basically get a 1-year subscription to anything you want from JetBrains. So with that, I think that pretty much wraps it up. All right, last chance, folks. Any questions? It's quiet chat night, guys. Come on. Nothing. All right. Well, in that case, then I think we'll close things up. A reminder, next month we have Chris Woodruff be presenting, and then that sort of wraps up our year. So then, as always, as we've brought up before, we would love for everyone to give us suggestions for topics for next year so we can start getting things lined up. And please remember that you can always give us tips and pointers on how to find some good presenters on topics that you want to see, especially now that conferences are getting back in order. It's a good chance to see a good presentation and say, hey, they should present that at the .NET user group. So thank you all, and we'll see you next month. Good night, everyone.
See ya.